The letter was sitting on my front porch, half buried under 3 inches of fresh snow, when I found it at 7 in the morning on the coldest day of the year. I almost didn't notice it. I was too busy standing in my kitchen in a full winter coat, breathing vapor clouds into the air, watching my phone display a temperature reading of 14 degrees Fahrenheit inside my own house, because every single pipe in my home had frozen solid overnight, and I had no heat, no running water, and no idea how long it was going to take to fix any of it. I had a plumber on the phone, a space heater plugged into an extension cord that I was genuinely worried was going to trip the breaker, and a cup of instant coffee that had gone cold before I even finished making it. That was the morning I found the letter. That was the morning everything changed. Let me back up a little so you understand what kind of neighborhood I live in, because context matters here. I bought my house in Crestwood Pines about 4 years ago. It is one of those suburban developments from the early 2000s, all matching mailboxes and uniform brick facades, and a homeowners association that takes itself way too seriously. When I moved in, I thought the HOA was just going to be a minor inconvenience, like the kind of thing you pay a small fee to every month and then largely ignore. I was wrong about that. I was very wrong. The HOA is run by a board of 5 people, but in practice it is run by one person. Her name is Pamela Hargrove. She has been on the board for going on 6 years, which is 4 years longer than anyone else has lasted, mostly because everyone else burns out or gets steamrolled into resigning. Pamela is the kind of person who shows up to neighborhood events with a clipboard and an expression like she just smelled something bad. She drives a white SUV that she parks at a slight angle in her driveway, as if the normal rules of geometry do not apply to her. She once sent a formal warning letter to a family on Birchwood Court because their front door wreath was, and I am quoting the letter directly here, quote, displaying non-seasonal foliage inconsistent with community aesthetic standards, end quote. The wreath in question was a basic green pine wreath that they had put up in November and forgot to take down in February. Pamela noticed it in February and sent the letter. That is the level of attention to detail we are dealing with. I had already had 2 run-ins with Pamela before this whole frozen pipe situation. The first one was when she sent me a warning about my trash cans being visible from the street, because I had rolled them to the curb on a Sunday night instead of waiting until Monday morning. The second one was when she took issue with the string of lights I put up along my roofline in December, claiming they were not symmetrically aligned with my roofline and therefore violated the community appearance guidelines. I pushed back on that one because I had actually read the guidelines and they said nothing about symmetry. She backed down, but not before sending me 2 follow-up emails and a certified letter, all of which I kept, because I am the kind of person who keeps things like that. So when I say I was not surprised to find a letter from the HOA that morning, I mean it. What I was surprised by was the timing, because anyone with eyes and a functioning thermometer could see what was happening in our neighborhood that week. We had been hit with a brutal cold snap that came down from Canada, the kind of weather that local news stations describe using words like historic and record-breaking. The overnight low the previous night had been 8 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was before accounting for wind chill. 3 of my neighbors had already lost pipes. The roads were sheets of ice because the town had run out of salt and the plows were running behind. People were struggling. This was not a minor inconvenience. This was a legitimate winter emergency situation. And right in the middle of all of that, someone had walked up to my porch, placed an official HOA warning letter in a sealed envelope with the Crestwood Pines HOA logo printed on it, and left it there for me to find under the snow. I picked it up. I brushed the snow off. I went back inside and stood next to my barely warm space heater and opened it. The letter was printed on HOA letterhead, very official looking, dated the previous day. It was addressed to me, Greg Rogers, at my full address. And it informed me, in very formal and bureaucratic language, that my property was in violation of HOA community standards, specifically Section 4, Subsection 2 of the Crestwood Pines HOA governing documents regarding snow removal and driveway maintenance. According to the letter, I had failed to clear my driveway and front walkway of snow and ice within the required 24-hour window following the end of a snowfall event, and if I did not come into compliance within 72 hours, I would be subject to a $150 fine. I stood there reading that letter 3 times. 3 times, because I needed to make absolutely sure I was reading it correctly. My pipes were frozen. I had no running water. I had no heat. The roads in and out of my neighborhood were iced over, and the town was in the middle of what the mayor was calling a state of weather emergency. And someone, some actual human being, had taken the time to walk to my house in the middle of all of that and leave me a warning letter about my driveway. I started laughing, not because it was funny in a happy way, but because it was so absurd that laughing felt like the only reasonable response. My neighbor across the street, a retired guy named Frank, was out in his driveway at that moment trying to chip ice off his windshield with a spatula because he could not find his ice scraper, and I held up the letter and yelled over to him. Frank came over, read it, and said something very colorful that I will not repeat verbatim. Then he handed it back to me and said, and I quote, "You should put that online." So I did. I took a photo of the letter, clear, well lit, the whole thing readable. I took a second photo showing my thermometer app with the outdoor temperature reading and the timestamp. I took a third photo showing my driveway, which was covered in about 6 inches of packed snow and ice, and in the background you could very clearly see the road, which was equally covered and had not been touched by a plow. Then I went to the Crestwood Pines neighborhood Facebook group, which had about 800 members, and I posted all 3 photos with a very simple caption. I wrote, "My pipes are currently frozen and I have no heat or running water. My driveway looks like this. The roads look like this." And apparently, the HOA found time to walk to my house and drop off this warning letter about my snow removal during a declared weather emergency. I put my phone down and went back to dealing with my actual problems. I had a plumber coming who had warned me it might be a 4 to 6 hour job depending on how bad the freeze was, and I needed to figure out an alternate source of heat before the space heater situation became dangerous. About 40 minutes later, I picked my phone back up to check something, and I had over 60 notifications from the neighborhood Facebook group. An hour after that, it was over 200. By the time the plumber showed up that afternoon, the post had been shared over 150 times, not just within the neighborhood group, but into a couple of larger local community groups and a general HOA stories group that apparently had tens of thousands of members. People were commenting from all over the place, not just my neighborhood. Comments from other states. Comments from people who had never heard of Crestwood Pines in their lives, just weighing in because apparently HOA horror stories have a universal appeal that cuts across all geographic boundaries. The comments from my actual neighbors were the most interesting ones, though. Because once I had opened that particular door, people started talking, and it turned out I was not the only person who had received a warning letter during the storm. My neighbor 3 houses down on the left, a woman named Teresa who was dealing with a broken furnace on top of everything else, had gotten one too. The family at the end of the cul-de-sac with the 2 little kids had gotten one. A guy on the next street over who had been in the hospital with his wife for a cardiac procedure had gotten one, and his daughter had been trying to manage his house from 2 states away during the whole thing. At least 7 people in the neighborhood had received these letters within a 48-hour window, all during the worst cold snap in about a decade. The neighborhood Facebook group, which normally was used to post things like lost cat notices and recommendations for good pizza places, turned into something else entirely. People were angry. Not just mildly irritated, but genuinely furious in the way that happens when people realize they have been dealing with the same frustration in isolation, and suddenly discover they are not alone. I want to be fair about something here. Technically, the HOA rules did say that driveways had to be cleared within 24 hours of a snowfall. That was a real rule that was actually in the governing documents. So Pamela was not making something up from thin air. What she was doing was enforcing a rule with zero regard for context, circumstances, or basic human decency, during conditions that were genuinely dangerous and that any reasonable person would recognize as exceptional. There is a difference between rules and the rigid, weaponized application of rules, and that difference is judgment and empathy, neither of which seem to be in particularly abundant supply. I found out later, through a neighbor who lived directly across from Pamela, that Pamela herself had hired a private snow removal service to clear her driveway on the day in question. The service had come, cleared her drive, salted it, and left. Her driveway was pristine, and then she had apparently gone around the neighborhood in her white SUV, noting which driveways were not cleared, and then gone home and printed out a stack of warning letters which she had delivered personally, on foot. In 8-degree weather, which, if nothing else, you have to acknowledge is a committed level of pettiness. The plumber finished with my pipes late in the afternoon. The damage was real. 2 pipes had cracked from the freeze, and fixing them, plus the emergency call-out fee, cost me just over $900. I want you to hold that number in your head. $900 spent on emergency repairs to damage caused directly by the record cold weather. That was also the reason my driveway was not cleared. And the HOA wanted to add a $150 fine on top of that. That evening, once I had running water again and the pipes were repaired, and I had borrowed a better electric space heater from Frank across the street to supplement my struggling central heating system while it recovered, I sat down at my kitchen table, and I did what I probably should have done a long time ago. I actually read the entire Crestwood Pines HOA governing documents from start to finish. It took about 2.5 hours. The documents were long, written in that particular flavor of dry legal language that makes your eyes want to slide off the page. But I read the whole thing, and here is what I found. First, the snow removal rule that Pamela had cited was real. It was in Section 4, subsection 2, exactly as the letter stated. 24 hours after the cessation of a snowfall event. That checked out. Second, buried in Section 7, which covered enforcement procedures, there was a clause that I doubt many homeowners had ever read. It stated that enforcement of community standards was subject to the board's discretion, and that enforcement actions could be deferred in cases of documented hardship or circumstances beyond the homeowner's reasonable control. In other words, if someone had frozen pipes and no heat during a record cold snap that the mayor had declared a weather emergency, that was pretty clearly a circumstance beyond the homeowner's reasonable control, and the board had the discretion to not issue the fine. Third, and this was the one that made me set down my coffee cup and stare at the wall for a moment, Section 9 covered the board's conduct and duties. And Section 9, Subsection 4 stated very clearly that board members were required to act in the best interests of the community and could not use their position to selectively enforce rules in a manner that was arbitrary, capricious, or retaliatory. If it could be demonstrated that enforcement was being applied selectively, that was a violation of the board members' fiduciary duty to the HOA itself. Now, I happen to know a little bit about property law. Not in a professional way, I am not a lawyer, but I went through a landlord-tenant dispute about 6 years ago that taught me how to read a contract and how to understand what terms like fiduciary duty and selective enforcement actually mean in practice. And I knew enough to recognize that what Pamela had done, sending warning letters to a bunch of homeowners during a declared weather emergency while apparently using her own discretion to handle her own driveway through a hired service, looked a lot like exactly the kind of arbitrary and selective enforcement that Section 9 prohibited. I made a cup of tea, took out a legal pad, and started taking notes. I wrote down every instance I could remember of receiving HOA correspondence. I documented the dates, the nature of the violation alleged, and the outcome. Then I posted in the Facebook group asking if other people who had received letters during the storm would be willing to share their letters and let me photograph or scan them. Within 2 hours, I had responses from 6 neighbors. By the next morning, I had physical copies or clear photos of 9 warning letters, all dated within the same 48-hour window, all citing the same Section 4, Subsection 2, snow removal rule, all issued during the same declared weather emergency. 9 households, each facing their own versions of what I had been dealing with: frozen pipes, broken furnaces, family members in hospital, power outages. 9 households that Pamela had apparently decided needed formal warning letters, while the town was literally in a state of emergency. I also reached out, on a bit of a gut feeling, to a woman named Sandra who lived on Maple Ridge Drive in the neighborhood, and who I knew had served on the HOA board for about 2 years before resigning. Sandra was someone I had talked to at a neighborhood barbecue once, and she had struck me as sharp and straightforward. I sent her a message explaining what was going on and asking if she had any insight. Sandra responded within 20 minutes, and she was not shy about it. She said she had resigned from the board because she had come to feel that Pamela ran it as her personal fiefdom and ignored input from other board members. She said that budget decisions were often made by Pamela unilaterally without proper board votes, and she specifically mentioned that the HOA had been paying for a landscaping service at a rate that Sandra found suspiciously high, higher than any of the competing quotes she had obtained when she tried to do a cost comparison. Sandra said she had raised this at a board meeting and Pamela had shut it down, and 2 months later Sandra had resigned. I wrote all of that down on my legal pad too, because now I was not just looking at overzealous rule enforcement during a winter storm. I was starting to wonder if there was something bigger going on. The internet had not forgotten about my Facebook post, by the way. While all of this was happening offline, the post had continued spreading. It had been picked up by a couple of local news Facebook pages. A journalist from the regional newspaper had slid into my messages asking if I wanted to comment for an article they were working on about HOA practices during the storm. A woman from an HOA watchdog nonprofit based 3 states away had messaged me with information about homeowner rights organizations and how to file formal complaints against HOA boards. I talked to the journalist briefly and confirmed the basic facts without getting into the details of what I was putting together. I told her that yes, I had received the letter, yes, my pipes were frozen at the time, and yes, I thought it raised legitimate questions about priorities and judgment. She said she was talking to several other homeowners in the neighborhood and would have something published by the end of the week. Meanwhile, the mood in the neighborhood had shifted significantly. The Facebook group had jumped from 800 members to over 1,000 as people invited friends and family who also lived in Crestwood Pines but had not been in the group. People who had never posted anything were suddenly very vocal. There was a growing consensus that something needed to change, and that the upcoming HOA annual meeting, which was scheduled for late February, was going to look very different than usual. On the 3rd day after the original post, I got a phone call from a number I did not recognize. When I answered, it was Pamela. I want to describe this call accurately because it tells you a lot about how she operates. She did not start by asking about my pipes or expressing any concern about what I had been through. She started by telling me that she had become aware of my social media post and that she was concerned that inaccurate information was being spread about the HOA, and that this kind of thing could damage the reputation of the community and affect property values. She said this in a very measured voice, the kind of voice that is trying very hard to sound calm and reasonable while underneath it there is something else entirely. I let her finish. Then I said, very politely, that I did not believe any of the information I had shared was inaccurate, and that the letter I had posted was the letter I received, and that the condition of my pipes at the time was documentable through the plumber's invoice and the records from my emergency call. There was a pause. Then she said that perhaps the letter had been sent in error, and that the board would be reviewing all enforcement actions taken during the storm period. She said this in a way that was clearly intended to make me feel like I should feel grateful and stand down. I said that I thought a review sounded like a good idea, and that I would be very interested in seeing the criteria the board used to determine which homeowners received letters and which did not, and whether any board members' own properties had been inspected during the same period. Another pause, longer this time. She said she was sure there were straightforward explanations for everything, and that she hoped I was not planning to escalate this unnecessarily. I said I was not planning to escalate anything unnecessarily. I said I was planning to attend the annual meeting and participate in the community process, as I was entitled to do as a dues-paying member of the HOA. The call ended shortly after that. I immediately wrote down everything she had said, as close to verbatim as I could get, with the time and date of the call. This was not the first time that documentation had saved me in a dispute situation, and I was not going to let it be the last. 2 days later, the newspaper article ran. It was not front-page news, but it was in the local section, and it was not gentle. The headline was something along the lines of Residents Question HOA Priorities, after warning letters issued during storm emergency. The article quoted me. It quoted Teresa. It quoted the guy whose wife had been in the hospital for the cardiac procedure. And it quoted a housing rights attorney who the journalist had apparently called for context. The attorney, speaking generally rather than about our specific case, said that HOA boards had a fiduciary obligation to their members, and that enforcement actions taken in a way that was arbitrary or that failed to account for documented hardship could expose boards to legal liability. I watched the Facebook group when the article dropped. It was like watching a fire catch. People were sharing it everywhere. Parents who had been quietly annoyed about HOA rules for years were suddenly expressing those frustrations openly. A woman named Deborah, who I vaguely recognized from seeing her at the neighborhood pool in summer, organized a group chat separate from the main Facebook group for people who wanted to coordinate for the annual meeting. Within a day, that chat had over 40 people in it. Deborah was organized. Like, impressively organized. She had clearly done this kind of thing before, or at the very least she had a natural talent for it. She created a document listing all the current HOA board members, their terms, which seats were up for election at the annual meeting, and what the process was for nominating new board members. She compiled a list of questions people wanted answered at the meeting, ranging from the specific weather emergency enforcement decisions to broader questions about budget transparency. And she reached out to Sandra, who was willing to provide background information, though she made it clear she did not want to be formally involved given that she had moved on. Here is where things got genuinely interesting, in a way I had not fully anticipated. Sandra had mentioned the landscaping service and the suspicious billing rates. I had filed that away mentally but had not done much with it. But one of the people in Deborah's group chat was a man named Al who worked as a certified public accountant. And when he heard about the landscaping situation, he asked if anyone could get their hands on the HOA's financial statements, which, as it turned out, were required to be made available to HOA members on request under state law. 3 people submitted formal written requests for the HOA financial records the same week. Under state law, the HOA had a set number of days to respond. I was one of the 3 who submitted a request. I sent mine via certified mail, so there was a delivery confirmation. While we waited for the financial records, something else happened that I had not expected. One of the neighbors on the next street, a guy named Marcus who was very quiet and who I mostly knew because we sometimes nodded at each other getting the mail, sent me a private message. He said he had a doorbell camera and a security camera that covered his driveway, and that both cameras had captured footage from the night Pamela had walked around the neighborhood delivering the warning letters. He had reviewed the footage because he was curious after seeing my post. Here is what the footage showed. Pamela making her rounds on foot, carrying what appeared to be a stack of envelopes. That was not particularly surprising. What was surprising was that she appeared to be very deliberately skipping certain houses. Marcus had a timestamp on his camera, and he had gone through the footage carefully enough to note which driveways she stopped at and which ones she walked past without stopping. And the houses she had stopped at to leave letters were not randomly selected. They were, based on what Marcus could observe, almost entirely houses where the driveways were uncleared. But here is the thing. There were several other houses with equally uncleared driveways that she had walked right past. And when Marcus looked into it a bit, the houses she had skipped appeared to largely belong to neighbors who were known to be friendly with Pamela or who were on friendly terms with the board. This was now moving well beyond overzealous enforcement during a storm. This was documented selective enforcement. We had a security camera recording of a board member making enforcement decisions on the basis of what appeared to be personal favoritism. That was not just bad judgment. That was exactly the kind of arbitrary and capricious selective enforcement that Section 9, Subsection 4 of the HOA's own governing documents prohibited, and that the housing rights attorney had described as potentially exposing the board to legal liability. I called the housing rights attorney myself. I got her contact information from the newspaper article. I explained the situation in detail. The letters during the weather emergency, the documentation from 9 homeowners, the governing document provisions about discretion and selective enforcement, and now the security camera footage. She listened carefully and asked a few clarifying questions, and then said something that I had been half expecting but was still satisfying to hear. She said this was a real case. Not a slam dunk, she was careful about that, but a genuine potential legal claim of selective enforcement and breach of fiduciary duty. She said she would be willing to take a preliminary look at the documentation and advise us on options. We put together what I started calling the packet. I hate that it sounds so formal because the whole thing started with me standing in my freezing house in a winter coat reading a ridiculous letter. But the packet ended up being about 40 pages. It included the 9 warning letters with timestamps and homeowner statements. It included Marcus's security camera footage on a USB drive with a written summary of what it showed. It included my full documented history of HOA correspondence going back to when I first moved in. It included Sandra's written statement about the board conduct issues she had witnessed. It included the financial records request confirmation and the clock ticking on the HOA's required response window. And it included a printout of the relevant sections of the governing documents with the key passages highlighted. The annual meeting was now about 3 weeks away. The meeting was being held in the community center, which was a small building adjacent to the neighborhood pool. Normally, these meetings had maybe 20 people. This one looked like it was going to be significantly larger. The financial records came through about 10 days before the meeting. The HOA was technically required to provide them, and to their credit they did provide them, though they took every one of the allotted days before doing so. Al, the accountant, went through them over a weekend and came back with a detailed analysis. And what he found was genuinely concerning. The landscaping service that Sandra had flagged. Its name was Greenview Property Services. The HOA had been paying it monthly for general grounds maintenance, snow removal in common areas, and what the records described as aesthetic enhancement services. The rate being paid was significantly above market rate. Al had done some comparison shopping and established that comparable services in our area ran anywhere from 20 to 40% less than what Greenview was being paid. More interesting was what Al found when he looked into the company itself. Greenview Property Services had been incorporated about 5 years ago. Its registered agent was a man named Dale Hargrove. Dale Hargrove. Hargrove. As in Pamela Hargrove's husband. I am not going to pretend I did not feel a very specific kind of chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather when I read that. Because that was not just bad management or selective enforcement of parking rules. That was the HOA board president directing community funds to a company owned by her husband, without any visible disclosure to the board or to the membership, at above-market rates. That was a textbook conflict of interest. Depending on how you characterized it, it was potentially a whole lot more than that. I called the attorney back with this new information. She was quiet on the phone for a moment, and then she said, clearly and carefully, "This changes the picture." She said that what Al had found potentially constituted fraud, specifically self-dealing by a fiduciary, which in many states carries real legal consequences. She said she wanted to bring in a colleague of hers who had more experience with HOA fraud cases specifically, and that they would review everything together before advising us on next steps. Deborah, meanwhile, had continued organizing. She had confirmed that 2 board seats were up for election at the annual meeting, and that any HOA member in good standing could be nominated, including from the floor at the meeting itself. She had 2 candidates lined up who were willing to run, both longtime residents with good reputations and no conflicts of interest. She had also, in a move that impressed me considerably, contacted the local news station and quietly let them know that the annual meeting might be worth covering. The day before the meeting, the attorney's colleague called me. He walked me through the legal situation clearly and methodically. He said that what we had documented was likely enough to support a formal complaint to the State Real Estate Commission, which had oversight authority over HOA boards. He said the self-dealing situation, if it could be substantiated, could result in Pamela being removed from the board and potentially facing personal financial liability for the overpayments made to her husband's company. He said that criminal fraud charges were possible depending on the full amount involved and the specific statutes in our state, but that was for the district attorney's office to determine, not him. He advised me that the cleanest path was to present everything at the annual meeting in front of the full membership, call for a formal vote of no confidence in Pamela's leadership, pass a motion to retain legal counsel on behalf of the HOA membership to investigate the financial irregularities, and simultaneously file the complaint with the state commission. He also said something that I thought was very smart. He said that Pamela was likely to try to control the meeting. HOA annual meetings have rules, and whoever controls the gavel controls the agenda. He recommended that we review the HOA bylaws for the meeting procedures and identify any provisions that required items to be added to the agenda if a sufficient number of members requested it. Because sure enough, buried in the bylaws, there was such a provision. If 15% of the membership submitted a written request to add an agenda item at least 5 days before the meeting, it had to be added. We had well over 15% of the membership in Deborah's group chat alone. We submitted the request 3 days before the meeting. The agenda items we requested were: first, a discussion of enforcement actions taken during the December weather emergency. Second, a review of HOA vendor contracts and compliance with disclosure requirements. Third, a vote on whether to retain independent legal counsel to review HOA financial practices. I drove to the community center on the night of the annual meeting through streets that were finally, mostly, cleared, 2.5 weeks after the storm. The cold had let up a little, maybe 28 degrees, which felt almost warm at that point. There were cars parked all the way down the street from the community center because the small lot was full. I counted people as I walked in and stopped counting at about 90. For a neighborhood annual meeting that normally drew 20 people, this was remarkable. Pamela was already there when I arrived. She was standing near the front of the room with 2 other board members, and I could see the exact moment she registered how many people were in the room. Her expression did a very specific thing. A quick flash of something that might have been alarm, very quickly replaced by the composed, slightly condescending expression that was her default setting. She was wearing a blazer, which seemed like she was trying to project authority. A local news camera crew had set up in the back of the room, which Pamela also clocked. Her jaw tightened slightly. The meeting started. Pamela called it to order and began going through the standard agenda items, financials, committee reports, the usual. She spoke briskly and confidently, clearly hoping to get through as much as possible before the homeowner discussion items came up. But when she announced the agenda, she made a point of saying that some additional items had been submitted for discussion, and that the board had reviewed them and would address them in due course, which was very different from confirming they were formally on the agenda. From the third row, a man stood up. It was Al. He said, very politely but very firmly, that under Section 12, subsection 3 of the HOA bylaws, items submitted by at least 15% of the membership were required to be included on the formal agenda and addressed before the meeting concluded, and that he would like the chair to confirm this was the case. Pamela started to say something about the board's discretion in agenda setting, and Al simply, very calmly, read the bylaw provision out loud. From memory. He had memorized it. The room was completely quiet while he read it. When he finished, a couple of people started clapping and then more joined in, and it became a full round of applause. Pamela's composed expression cracked slightly. She said that of course the agenda items would be addressed and moved on. When the time came for the homeowner discussion items, I stood up and I laid it out. I had prepared for this. I had notes on index cards and I spoke clearly and without rushing. I started with the original story, the frozen pipes, the warning letter, the Facebook post. I acknowledged that the rule was a real rule and that Pamela had not invented it. Then I explained Section 7 and the discretionary hardship provision, and I explained what 9 homeowners had experienced when they received letters during the weather emergency. I talked about the security camera footage from Marcus's camera, which was playing on a laptop near the front of the room, showing Pamela walking the neighborhood and selectively stopping at certain houses while walking past others with identical driveway conditions. I could hear people reacting to that footage as it played. There were audible murmurs. Then I introduced Al, who stood up and presented his financial analysis in about 10 minutes, clear and methodical, the kind of presentation you get from someone who has been doing this professionally for 20 years. He showed the HOA payment records to Greenview Property Services. He showed the market rate comparisons. And then he showed the incorporation records for Greenview, with Dale Hargrove listed as registered agent. The room erupted. Not in a chaotic way, but in that specific way where 60 or 70 people all start talking to each other at once, and you can feel the temperature of the collective mood change in real time. Pamela stood up and tried to take control of the microphone. She said that Greenview Property Services was a reputable company and had always provided excellent service, and that the relationship with the owner had been fully disclosed to the board at the time of contracting. From the back of the room, one of the other board members, a quiet man named Stephen who had been on the board for 2 years and who had, until this moment, mostly been invisible, stood up and said clearly and loudly that he had no recollection of any such disclosure, and that he had never been informed that the owner of Greenview had any relationship to the board president, and that had he known that he would have insisted on a formal conflict of interest review before any contract was signed. The news camera swung toward Stephen. From there, it moved quickly. The motion to retain independent legal counsel passed by an overwhelming show of hands. The vote of no confidence in Pamela's continued service as board president also passed, though Pamela disputed the vote and demanded a formal count, which was conducted, and which she lost by a margin of 73 to 11. Pamela was not legally removed from the board that night, because the process for removal required a formal hearing under the bylaws, but the vote sent a message that was not ambiguous. Both open board seats went to candidates backed by Deborah's organizing group. Between that and Stephen's position, the board balance had shifted, and Pamela's effective control over it was gone. The formal complaint to the State Real Estate Commission was filed the following Monday. 3 other homeowners and I were co-complainants. The complaint included the full packet: the warning letters, the security camera footage, Al's financial analysis, the corporate records for Greenview, and Stephen's written statement about not being informed of the conflict of interest. The investigation moved slower than any of us would have liked, as these things do. Winter turned to spring. The snow melted. My pipe stayed functional, and I had made sure to properly insulate the vulnerable sections as part of the repair. My driveway was impeccably cleared every time it snowed, partly because I genuinely cared about it and partly, I admit, because it brought me a small quiet pleasure to know that no one could send me another warning letter. The HOA, now operating under its reconstituted board, suspended enforcement of fines for the homeowners who had received letters during the weather emergency, pending review. The independent legal counsel they hired reviewed the Greenview contract and confirmed that there had been no proper disclosure and no conflict of interest review, and recommended that the HOA seek repayment from Pamela personally for the excess amounts paid above market rate over the life of the contract, which over 5 years amounted to approximately $38,000. Pamela resigned from the board in March. She sent a brief letter to the board stating she was resigning effective immediately to pursue other interests, which was about as graceful an exit as one could hope for from someone who had effectively been running the neighborhood as her personal domain for 6 years. The State Real Estate Commission concluded its investigation in late spring. Their finding was that Pamela Hargrove had engaged in self-dealing and a breach of fiduciary duty in violation of the state's HOA governance statutes by directing contract funds to a company owned by her spouse without proper disclosure or board authorization. They referred the matter to the State Attorney General's office for review of potential criminal liability. In early summer, I got a call from a detective at the county sheriff's office. He asked me to confirm some details about the financial records and my interactions with Pamela. I confirmed everything and sent him a copy of the documentation I had kept. About 3 weeks after that call, I was sitting in my backyard enjoying what felt like the first genuinely warm evening of the year when Frank from across the street walked over. He was grinning. He said he had just driven past Pamela's house, and there was a police car parked out front. I will not pretend I felt nothing about that, but I also want to be fair. I did not start any of this hoping for Pamela to be arrested. I posted a photo of a letter because it was absurd, and because I was cold and frustrated, and had just paid $900 to fix my pipes. What happened after that was the result of a lot of other people getting involved and contributing information and expertise that I did not have, and the result of those things happening to lead somewhere real. Pamela was charged with misappropriation of HOA funds and breach of fiduciary duty, both misdemeanor charges in our state, which could carry fines and up to a year in county jail depending on the judge. She was processed and released on her own recognizance that same evening. The trial was scheduled for the fall. The HOA filed a civil suit against her separately to recover the $38,000 in excess payments. That suit settled out of court, which is typically what happens in these situations. I was told the settlement amount was confidential, but that the HOA received a substantial portion of what was sought. At the first full community meeting of the new board in July, with the pool open behind the community center and people showing up in summer clothes rather than winter coats, the new board president announced several things. The Greenview contract had been terminated and replaced with a new landscaping vendor at market rate, saving the HOA approximately $7,000 annually. The enforcement procedures had been revised to include an explicit hardship review process for any enforcement action issued during declared weather emergencies or other extraordinary circumstances, and the annual HOA fees had been reduced slightly for all homeowners as a result of the vendor savings. People clapped. Real clapping, not the polite kind. I ran into Teresa, who had gotten one of the other warning letters, in the parking lot afterward. She said something I have thought about a few times since. She said that none of this would have happened if Pamela had just been reasonable about the driveway letters. If she had simply not sent them, or had sent them and then retracted them gracefully when people pushed back, none of the rest of it would have unraveled. It was the sheer arrogance of it, the idea that even during a genuine emergency people needed to be formally warned about snow removal, that had brought enough people together to actually look closely at what was going on. The pettiness had been the crack in the wall. She was right about that. I had lived in Crestwood Pines for 4 years and mostly kept to myself, paid my dues, dealt with the occasional irritating letter, and moved on. The frozen pipes and that yellow envelope sitting in the snow were what changed things, not because I planned it that way, but because sometimes a small absurdity lands at exactly the wrong moment, and the only thing you can do is take a photo of it and let other people decide what to make of it. In the fall, Pamela's criminal case concluded. She pleaded no contest to the misdemeanor charges. She received a fine of $5,000 and 2 years of probation. No jail time, which was not particularly satisfying in a dramatic sense, but it was a real legal consequence, and the conviction was a matter of public record. The trial made the local newspaper again. The reporter who covered it was the same one who had written the original Storm article, and she wrote a follow-up piece that connected the frozen pipes letter to the full arc of what had happened. It was a pretty good piece, honestly. She had a talent for the narrative thread. Pamela and her husband listed their house in Crestwood Pines for sale in November. By the time the first snow of the new season fell, they were gone. The first snow of that new season came on a Tuesday evening. I watched it from my kitchen window, the one that faces the backyard, nursing a cup of coffee that was actually warm this time because I was standing next to a properly functioning furnace in a properly insulated house with pipes that had been wrapped and inspected by 2 separate plumbers just to make sure. The snow came down soft and steady, covering everything cleanly. I did not get a warning letter. What I got the next morning was a message in the neighborhood group from the new board president, a woman named Linda who had been one of Deborah's candidates, reminding everyone that the snow removal timeline was 24 hours as always, but that if anyone was experiencing hardship or emergency conditions, they should reach out to the board directly, and the situation would be handled with common sense and courtesy. She ended the message by saying that the board was here to serve the community, not the other way around. Simple words, not exactly revolutionary. But in a neighborhood that had spent 6 years under Pamela Hargrove's clipboard regime, they landed like they meant something because they did. Frank texted me after Linda's message went up. He sent just 3 words. "Pretty good, huh?" "Pretty good," I agreed. I shoveled my driveway that morning, not because I was worried about a fine, but because it needed to be done and I had a good shovel, and the snow was the light kind that clears easily. I cleared my walkway and put down some ice melt. I waved to my neighbor Marcus when he came out to do his, and he waved back, and somewhere in the neighborhood a dog was barking at the snow with that particular joy that dogs have about snow, like it is the greatest gift the sky has ever delivered. It was a perfectly ordinary winter morning in a neighborhood that had been through a genuinely strange year, and I stood in my driveway in the cold with my shovel and felt, genuinely, pretty good about where things had landed. The post that had started it all was still up, by the way. It had accumulated over 3,000 comments by the time everything was said and done, and people were still occasionally finding it and adding comments months later. The last time I checked, someone had commented, quote, "The audacity of sending that letter during a weather emergency. HOAs need to be held accountable," end quote. I did not argue with that. $900 in plumbing repairs, a letter that should never have been sent, a photo posted on Facebook on a morning when I was cold and frustrated and out of running water. It is genuinely remarkable what can happen when you decide to just let other people see the absurdity for themselves and trust them to recognize it. Sometimes the pipes freeze. Sometimes you find a letter in the snow. And sometimes, if you pay attention to what that letter is really telling you, you end up discovering that the problem is a lot bigger than a driveway, and that there are a lot of other people in your neighborhood who have been waiting for someone to finally say something out loud. I am glad I said it. I am glad Frank told me to put it online. I am glad Al checked the financial records and Marcus reviewed his security footage, and Sandra gave her statement, and Deborah organized the meeting, and the attorney took the case, and Stephen stood up in the back of that room and said he had not been told. It took all of those pieces, all of those people, to turn one absurd warning letter into something that actually changed anything. But it started with the letter. It started with someone deciding that even during a record-breaking cold snap and a declared weather emergency, with people's pipes frozen and their furnaces failing and their families huddled around space heaters, the most important thing they could do that day was make sure a stack of envelopes got delivered to the right driveways. It started with that, and it ended with a conviction, a civil settlement, a board that actually worked for the neighborhood, and one winter morning where I shoveled my own driveway in peace. I kept the original letter framed on the wall of my home office. People who come over and notice it always ask about it, and I always tell them the story. It takes a while, but it is a pretty good one.